busy 24 hours for Governor Greg Abbott. First, he signed off on a controversial bill that shapes how current events are taught in our schools.
Now he is shifting his focus to the border. As we say good morning to Chris Ottegi, joining us live with more. We should learn more about his plans for the border later today, right, Chris?
Yes, Mark, we know he has been frustrated with the federal response down at the border. So therefore, the governor of Texas deciding he's going to take things into his own hands, and he has the help of a former president to do it. When Governor Greg Abbott visits the border on June 30th, he will have former President Donald Trump with him. That visit was announced yesterday following Abbott saying last week that Texas has plans to build its very own border wall, the project President Trump started. In a press release, Trump said he hopes his visit will send a message to ICE and Border Patrol agents that they still have the support in this country. Abbott is expected to release details of his border wall plan today, but he did reveal in a podcast that Texas will solicit individual donations to help pay for the wall's construction. We saw a similar fundraising effort before when a private campaign raised $25 million towards wall construction, but that effort ended in fraud indictments, including one for Trump's former advisor, Steve Bannon. In other issues, Abbott also signed into law the critical race theory bill. Like laws in other states, it limits teachers and schools on teaching about matters of race and their effects on society. The law mandates students will be taught the history of white supremacy and slavery in the country. However, it restricts teachers from openly and freely talking about current events involving race. Critics have been vocal about this law, saying it is silencing necessary conversations. Some districts like Dallas ISD have said prior to the signing that they may consider legal action against the bill. And this new law will apply to public schools K through 12 and will take effect on September 1st. Mark, Kara, back to you.